I do think the finest delivery that I have seen, talking about delivery, is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I mean, how anybody could get away with such enormously long pauses in front of a huge live audience, you know, and you feel the shivers going up and down your spine. But what about this way? I still think that in terms of phrases, it's hard to beat Winston Churchill, right? Never was so much owed by so many to so few. And it's so clever. When the first British victory of the war at Alamein, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps it is the end of the beginning. God, I'd never written that. How I loved that.
And I mean, one of the amazing things about Churchill is it shows that context is everything. Because you know, in the 30s, people thought that Churchill was bonkers for using that kind of language. There's a wonderful old film clip that of Churchill in the 30s when he'd just been knocked down by a car in New York, and he delivers in exactly that kind of language with exactly that kind of tone. He said, well, you know, I was knocked down and I was very lucky because I seem not to have been injured too badly. And you're thinking, but this is the man who delivers, and he sounds like a clown. But of course, in the context of the 1940s and the kind of the dangers, that suddenly that's exactly the kind of language that was needed. And I think actually, Marian, we've got a clip of Churchill's first radio broadcast.
Oh, let's listen to that.
After this battle in France abates its force, there will come the battle for our islands, for all that Britain is and all that Britain means. That will be the struggle. In that supreme emergency, we shall not hesitate to take every step, even the most drastic, to call forth from our people the last ounce and the last inch of effort of which they are capable. If this is one of the most awe-striking periods in the long history of France and Britain, it is also, beyond doubt, the most sublime. Side by side, the British and French peoples have advanced to rescue not only Europe, but mankind from the foulest and most soul-destroying tyranny which has ever darkened and stained the pages of history. Behind them, behind us, behind the armies and fleets of Britain and France, gather a group of shattered states and bludgeoned races, the Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Dutch, the Belgians, upon all of whom the long night of barbarism will descend, unbroken even by a star of hope, unless we conquer, as conquer we must, as conquer we shall.
That speech was first actually given in Parliament, isn't that right?
Quite a lot of that speech would have already been given in Parliament. The interesting thing about Churchill, and in particular that address, is that there is still a debate which has not been settled about whether that is actually Churchill speaking. That there's been all kinds of rumours about whether an actor called Norman Shelley actually delivered these radios, because Churchill was very self-conscious about his lisp. He was disdainful about the use of modern technology, including radio, and then later on television. And yet the BBC knew that these things had to get out there. And so this character, Norman Shelley, always claimed that he was the one who actually did these things. Now, Norman Shelley would have been quite well known to listeners at that time as Dennis the Dachshund from Toy Town on Children's Hour. So there is this kind of slightly incongruous kind of image of the man who the English, the British voted as the greatest Briton ever, having his speeches delivered for him by Dennis the Dachshund.
There is something
kind of
rather
a German dog.
The bulldog.
Exactly.
But when you hear that Churchill speech there, you can imagine just everybody sitting around their radios in their houses, hanging on every word, and maybe that's why speeches just aren't so significant anymore. The whole breakup of the broadcasting, you know, in its true sense, you know, moving radio then to television, and you had the big set pieces like Nixon going on television and telling people, I am not a crook, you know, this fantastic thing, and everyone's sitting down to watch this. But now, like, with the whole mass media, the breakup of television and radio, you just don't get the impression that speeches are really that important anymore, those big set piece speeches. And
we were talking about Blair, and I actually saw it live, and it was one heck of a speech.
And it was taken away a lot from speeches, because people now flash up their bullet points on the screen behind them, and they forget about the oratory. They just speak to the bullets, and I think that takes away a lot of the oratory that used to be in speeches.
I don't think Churchill's a man who would have used PowerPoint very effectively.
But now, talking about English speeches, the one that the speeches that I have greatest memory of are ones I never heard. It was the Queen's speech on Christmas Day, and my dad would never let us listen to them. He always said, "Why should we waste our Christmas Day listening to that woman?"
Right, well, speaking of that woman, a member of her family.
Yes, I mean, there's an incredible speech that we've got here, Edward VIII abdicating, and I think that this is one of those speeches that, frankly, people listening at the time would have been shocked by. First of all, because it was only really a couple of years that people had heard the royal family on the radio. King George V gave the first Christmas broadcast in 1932. So in 1936, when the king abdicates, this would have been really the first time they'd heard him speak. And you can hear the strain in his voice. Wallace Simpson, by this stage, is out of the country. Stanley Baldwin has not allowed Edward VIII to speak to the country before to make his case. Now, finally, he gets his chance to speak, and the news that he gives is that he's going to abdicate the throne, and you can hear the kind of the tension in his throat literally constricting as he delivers this incredible speech.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone. This was a thing I had to judge entirely for myself. The honor person most nearly concerned has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course.
Who was trying to persuade him to take a different course?
The kind of Wallace Simpson, but also, I mean, Churchill was kind of right behind Edward VIII on this. Stanley Baldwin is the one who's saying you should take he's the Prime Minister, you should take the throne and you should renounce this woman. One of the things that people were surprised about on hearing that speech was almost the kind of Cockney overtones to Edward VIII's voice. Now, I don't know whether that's something that an Irish audience would particularly pick up on, but to me, as somebody who's English, there's almost a kind of a touch of George Formby or Norman Wisdom in there, in the way that he says some of those. And of course, that's because in the 20s and 30s there was this kind of affectation that the English upper classes use of adopting a kind of almost a Cockney patois way of speaking. So there was a lot of comment on that kind of thing. But I think the important thing there is that Baldwin, one of the most astute politicians who's ever held the office of Prime Minister, tactically very aware, hadn't allowed the king to speak on the radio until the decision had been made. So there was no sense of being able to make his case earlier than that. And what's extraordinary about that transition is that this is something which, you know, kind of could have been presented as a coup d'etat, forcing the king out, or a constitutional crisis. And yet, in that kind of very English way, everything is sorted behind the scenes very quietly, and the transition to the new king takes place almost seamlessly. And Parliament, the day after that speech, just simply ratifies the decision, and life moves on.
It was a very extreme example when Emperor Hirohito broadcast to tell the Japanese they were defeated. Apparently, there was an imperial language spoken in the palace, and most ordinary Japanese couldn't really follow what he was saying. Because he spoke a different Japanese in the palace. However, I just remember the most significant broadcast in Irish history has to be De Valera's response to Churchill at the end of the war, which even I wasn't around then, but you know, it electrified the country. and nobody would have regarded De Valera as a wonderful orator or broadcaster.
No, because he had a very
particular-
dreary
That's
kind
right,
of style of
that's right.
delivery,
But
didn't
he did
he?
the business that day, yeah.
Well, I suppose people took pride too because he'd given comeuppance to Churchill.
Yeah, but it is a very fine speech.
Mm.
It is a very fine speech, yeah.
That speech and the consequences of the abdication and all of that, did it mean a huge amount to ordinary English people?
I think that the perception is no, it didn't. That partly because of the way that he had always been seen as a rather dissolute character. He was the playboy prince. He was very glamorous. But by the time you get to the 1930s, people are saying, well, you've had your playboy years. I suppose it's almost Prince Hal and Henry V, isn't it? That you've had your time as the kind of the heir to the throne. You've been a playboy, wine, women, and song. We all know about that. But now it's time for you to step up and do your duty. And I think as well there was a sense in which Wallis Simpson, she was no Princess Diana. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't.
Was she not?
She wasn't particular. I mean, she wasn't. At the time, she wasn't seen as being a great beauty or being particularly glamorous. The fact that she was American in the context of the 1930s, she was kind of presented as being an outsider coming in and undermining the system. There were also all kinds of scurrilous rumours going around about Wallis Simpson. She'd spent a lot of time in the Far East. And so the kind of the gossip that went round the clubs of London that was that while she'd been out in the Far East, she'd learnt all kinds of how can I put this, sexual techniques that had somehow kind of captivated the Prince of Wales and made him somehow her sex slave.
But going back
So all of these kind of things, and actually in terms of getting your message across. These gossip, the way you're perceived, these kind of things are almost as important as anything that you might
Perception
actually say.
as much as the reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Going back to our earlier conversation about media intrusion and bad behaviour, the British press agreed not to carry a word about the romance between Wallis Simpson and the King. It was all over the American papers, the Continental papers, they agreed they wouldn't mention it. And so the first the British public knew that this was even happening was that broadcast. So there's a contrast with today's.
I don't know, we did that here with Charlie Hawley and Terry King.
Well, that's true too. That was well known.
I think that it was the kind of thing that the gossip went round.
Oh,
I
those
remember,
who know.
my family comes from Ipswich in Suffolk, and Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII used to meet in Felixstowe, which is kind of just on the coast outside Ipswich. So I remember my grandmother saying that this is the kind of the gossip that used to go round the kind of the market in Ipswich, that the Prince of Wales had been seen with his American again out in Felixstowe. But that went on even until the 1950s. In 1953, Churchill had a stroke, and it meant that he was effectively out of number 10 for well over 6 months. And it was agreed with the press that it would be terribly bad if this got out, and that the public really shouldn't know about it. And so there was
In
there was
1953?
no report about it in this. Now,
I
can
can
you
understand
imagine?
it in the middle of a war,
Exactly.
maybe.
But Bertie Ahern has a mild cold, and it's there, kind of on the front page of the papers the next day.
But if I'd lied about the Wallis Simpson affair, it produced one of the great headlines of all time when Mrs. Simpson got a quickie divorce in Nevada, and the New York Times tabloid appeared with the immortal headline, King's Mall Renoed.
On that note, I think we'll draw back to it. That's a great headline. Thank you very much. If people are interested in those speeches that changed the world, introduction by Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's okay, Jude.
He's a very good writer. He's written a lot on Russia. He wrote a book called Stalin the Red